It's time for the Blazor Power Hour.
Welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
Introducing the Blazor Power Hour.
No, seriously, it's time for Blazor Power Hour.
Hey friends, it's time for the Blazor Power Hour.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
You're checking out the Blazor Power Hour.
Welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
It's Blazor Power Hour. Go Ed!
It's time for the Blazor Power Hour. And check out
Did that fix the sound? Are we having sound issues? Thanks, chat, for chiming in. Looks like, and I had somebody from work also popping in the back, so thank you, whoever that is. Don't know why that was doing what it was doing. Sorry about all that. So let me recap. Thank you, Eva. So to recap, with now with the sound outage problem, we were working on some Blazor layout components. We're able to do all of these things in CSS, but we found a lot of people are transitioning from Blazor on the desktop, or sorry, no, .NET on the desktop with XAML and on mobile with Xamarin. So Xamarin Forms, XAML, all of those things have a method of building layouts with markup rather than going into something like CSS. So you'll see here that we have a grid layout that has column definitions versus something like CSS where everything is done in the CSS file and it gets applied to the HTML. So there's a lot of developers out there that prefer to have this declarative style of making their grids, their layout grids in markup, which is a good transition point for people that are coming from these other platforms into something like Blazor Hybrid, that sort of thing. So at Telerik, we've added some components to our library to help people with this transition and kind of satisfy some of that declarative approach or programmatic approach. Some of these things, if you've got dynamic layouts, it's a little bit of a mind bend to get the values from your Blazor components into your CSS to change these layouts at runtime. So this is also a nice way to tackle these runtime problems where you need to adjust your layout for a given set of content. Maybe there's a certain number of dynamic records you're pulling in from a database or something. You want to adjust your grid layout accordingly, that sort of thing. This makes this much easier than it would be to approach it from a CSS point of view, because CSS doesn't really tie into Blazor directly with dynamic content. You have to be a little creative with that. Fuel's asking, what is Blazor Hybrid? Blazor Hybrid is something that's coming in .NET 6 that lets you write Blazor applications that have a shell component that runs inside of a native environment, which makes Blazor a native application on Mac, on Windows, and eventually on iOS and Android. So you're really going to be looking for a solution to maybe migrate some Silverlight applications or some desktop Windows applications so they run on all these new platforms. And if you're not familiar with CSS, this type of thing could be pretty difficult for you. So that's the idea of these Telerik layout components. And I'm going to go over the blog post that I wrote that shows you how to do this in CSS. We're going to turn this on its head and do it with these layout components instead. Fuel, it does not use yes, it does use a web view internally. So these are shells that bridge the .NET Core, which is now .NET 5 and will be .NET 6, runtime that runs on all of the cross-platform devices, but the shell lets you communicate with the native APIs on those platforms as well within your Blazor applications. And you can also mix and match Blazor code, Blazor UIs with those WPF and UWP interfaces as well. So there's something quite creative with it. And I think, now this is different than Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. It's kind of it's still Blazor, but it's got a different way of executing. It's more like Blazor Server than it is anything, but you'll have to look more into that. We covered it on a previous show, actually, if you want to look on YouTube, and we've got plenty of content on the channel in regards to Blazor Hybrid. And quick question about F# with Blazor. You cannot directly use F# with Blazor. You can indirectly use it. So if you have a compiled library, you can use that with Blazor, but you cannot write F# in the context of a Blazor application. So let's take a look at the Telerik grid layout. First thing, all of our components are prefixed with the Telerik, and then all of the child components underneath will drop that prefix. So we have a Telerik grid layout with grid layout columns, and in this first example that I have, what we want to do is set up a set of content that has two columns, one of them 3 fractions wide and 2 tall, and then the second row is going to be, or second column is going to be 5 fractions wide, 2 tall. If we look at the results of this, this is the idea. Let's see if we can get this full screen. This is the CSS HTML version of it. So we want each column to be twice as tall, or each row to be twice as tall as the second, and then each column to be, this one's going to be 3 and this one's going to be 5 units wide. So if we want to do that in this grid layout, what we need to do is specify a width, and on the width we want to say that this is going to be 3 fractions, so 3 FR. So the star operator does not work here that you have in XAML. This is HTML after all, so we do need to specify CSS in HTML units here. So we'll duplicate this, and then on the second column we'll do 5 fractions wide. So this is a grid that is a 3 by 5. 3 columns, 2 columns, a ratio of 3 to 5. So maybe if we express that as a ratio, it'd be a little bit easier. So grid column layout there, and then we want the grid row layout, rows, and then on a row, the grid layout row, we want to set the height, because the rows are going to be our height value. So on the height value, we want to use these fractions again, and we want the first row to be twice as large as the second. So we'll say this is going to be 2 fractions tall. And then on the second row, we want that to be 1 fraction. So the first row would be twice as big as the second. Now we don't have any content for this yet, so we have to specify the content next. So if we say grid layout items, we can put in an item collection here. So what I'm going to do is go back over to the HTML example, and we'll grab a couple content items out here. And each one of these items needs to be wrapped in a grid layout item. And that's going to tell the grid that this is a piece of content that needs to be laid out in one of these grid cells. So we're going to wrap each one of these in this grid layout item. And we'll drop these down here like this. And let's see if we can copy paste a little bit, make a little bit short work of this. We'll drop another one here and here, and just close off all of those tags. So you can see the HTML is going to be a little bit more verbose here. Some people prefer this. So we haven't written a single line of CSS. That's the trade-off here, is we're doing all of this in markup. Now if I go back and run this application, I don't have those nice CSS grid lines that are in here. That's some extra CSS magic that I pasted into this. Let's see if we can just highlight these in the browser real quick so you can see exactly where those rows are. And you can see the first one is twice as tall as the second. So just like it says in the text here, this column is 3 fractions wide and 2 tall, and this is 3 wide and 1 tall. And the second one is 5 wide, 2 tall, 5 wide, 1 tall. Now, if we want to programmatically work with something like this, what's interesting here is these are Blazor components. So we can for each and do loops and that type of thing right here. So if we had data coming from a database, for example, and we wanted to modify these things to repeat, maybe I want to repeat this behavior here, and then I also want to repeat the data that's coming in, just for a quick example of a scenario we may have. If I had 10 of these items coming in like this, this is totally valid Blazor code. And it makes it really easy to programmatically describe what we want to do with these layouts. So now you can see that repeating pattern here, where the first row, the first row is twice as tall as the second. And if we turn on our grid, you can see the lines there. That makes it look nice and clean. So hopefully this looks like something that folks would be interested in using. Because again, you're getting that trade-off. You're not doing all of this in CSS. We didn't have to write any CSS to do all of this. And we're able to do the normal Blazor activities in here, like use fors and for eaches and if statements and things in our Razor markup. So we can repeat these layouts. Now we have some other stuff to play with. So I'm going to collapse this down here. Let's actually start over on this page. We'll clean this out. Let's look at some other examples from that blog post. So in CSS, we have something called Flexbox, and in XAML, we have something called a stack panel. And this, again, in CSS requires you to know how to do this in CSS. And what we really want to do is this. We want to take these elements here, and we want to stack them vertically or horizontally. And with these new Telerik layout components, we can do that without going in and writing the CSS bits. So what I can do is say Telerik stack layout, and I have an orientation on a stack layout. So grid and stack layout behave just a little bit differently. So if you want nice, even items where each element is the same width and they all align in the same, they all start and stop, all of the elements start and stop within a linear column, you want a grid layout. If you don't care about the alignment of the items to each other, then you can use a stack layout, and these will repeat their layout. If they hit, say, the edge of the screen, they will repeat back in, starting on a new line. So those are kind of the differences of the two layouts. You can use these together, which we'll look at in just a minute. They're not mutually exclusive, so you can embed these things inside of each other and perform different types of layout mechanics. So you might use a grid layout to lay out your application, where the sidebar is, where the menu is going to be, and where the content will be. But within one of those grid cells, you might have a stack layout that lays out your menu items either vertically or horizontally. That's where these different layout components come in handy. So the orientation for this one, you can see I have a div of stack vertical. We're not going to write that CSS. Instead, we're going to say orientation, and we'll get IntelliSense here, that gives us stack layout orientation, and this is going to be a vertical orientation here. We can remove this line. We don't need that anymore. And we'll move these items up into that stack layout. Now, for the next one, I'll copy and paste. And we'll move this one down here and just give us another stack panel. This one's going to be horizontal. So again, I'll use IntelliSense to grab the horizontal orientation. And we can put these items in a horizontal orientation. So if we go in and run this, it's going to look fairly similar to the example in my blog post here, where my blog post has some additional styling on it. So it looks a little bit different as far as color goes. But if we view this full screen, there we go. You'll notice that these are aligned center, and these are clustered here in the middle versus how they're laying out here. So we need to adjust this a little bit if we want that same exact layout. So what's happening here is by default, the Telerik stack layout stretches the layout to the full width of that frame. So if we want to align all of these items to the center of that horizontal stack, what we can do is say horizontal align, and then stack panel horizontal align center. So people think centering things in on the web is hard. This will make it very easy, and this will change. We'll go back here. You can see this is now centered to the middle of the layout. And we can also do that for our vertical orientation as well. We'll save that. And let's see if I got that wrong here. Let me backtrack a little bit on that one. We may need to be in horizontal layout mode for that. So we've moved this one over. To center this one, we may need to add another panel in here just to make sure that that one, let's see, we could nest these actually. We should be able to nest these and get that same effect. Like so. There we go. So now they're centered on the screen, like the other layout is. Now, there's another thing about this that's that needs some adjusting. So we've got no spacing between the elements here. And one thing that these layouts do well is they help us with the spacing on these. So we'll say spacing and give this, say 20 pixels. We save that and go back. Now these items are spaced evenly 20 pixels apart. So this makes things much easier to work with. Now, what's interesting about the gap that's in here, the spacing that's in between these items, is this is a little bit different than, say, a margin would be, because there's no spacing on the leading or trailing edges of these, which is ideal for something like this. It makes laying these things out much, much easier when you don't have to accommodate for the first and last items and the margins that may have been applied if you're using something like CSS margins or padding to accomplish this type of spacing. Super helpful stuff there. So we can do this type of a layout as well, and we can customize the CSS here just like we can in just raw HTML as well. So if we wanted to come in here and add some CSS, we can just say class and then write our own CSS class to wrap these elements in and style those however we see fit. So in this one we had stack vertical, and if we want to give this some color and whatnot, we still need to write some CSS. So if we wanted stack vertical here, let's go ahead and in pages we'll add a new item, and we'll just add some color to this using some CSS. So while you don't have to be a CSS guru to write the layouts and all of that, you do need to know a little bit of CSS. This is the web after all, to add some color and some theme elements to this. So we'll use the Blazor methodology here of creating a scoped CSS file, some CSS isolation, say index.razor.css, and this one was called vertical. Stack vertical, we'll just call it vertical here. And then we can add our color elements to this. So we could say background color, and then we can add our background color here. We'll go borrow this from the blog post so we can have a nice color theme without having to remember what those color codes are. And then we can set like the text color here, just using color, and the color there was white, and that should give us, if I did that correctly, let's see here, my app is not running anymore, so let's go ahead and rerun the app. There we go. And my CSS not apply right. Let's double check why. Trying to see where my value was applied to this. So our custom class value isn't rendering for some reason. Let's double check here and make sure that all of this ran correctly. We'll do a run with debugging here. We should have a vertical class applied to the outermost element of this. So just double checking here, doing a little troubleshooting to see which element here this should have applied to, so we can adjust CSS or whatever if we need to. So we've got the built-in style. There's our vertical. So the style is being applied. It looks like CSS isolation is biting me here. So CSS isolation, FuelSnap knows exactly what I'm talking about with the CSS isolation headaches. Sometimes they can get a little bit in your way. Let's give this a try here. Sometimes isolation requires a container around these elements to work properly. And then I also, let's make sure it is in our index here. So this is our style sheet. It should be in there. Let's check our resources here. And I won't spend too much time on this if I can't get this to work. There's our style sheet. So what the CSS isolation stuff does is it applies this unique identifier to your style sheet. And if I look at my elements in this, I should have that same unique identifier attached to the elements. And it is not part of this this component. So this is where CSS isolation can get a little tricky, is sometimes the components themselves from external libraries, even your own, won't apply these values. It's part of Blazor, and it's actually in the documentation that this is the intended behavior here. So you find a little bit of mix and match with isolation, and I've had some discussions about how these things should and shouldn't work. Let's double check and see if we can get this going. If not, we'll just put it in normal CSS and roll from there. And my little trick to wrap this doesn't seem to want to work either. Let's back out of that one. Try it one more time. There it goes. Okay, that did finally work. But it's not stretching the length of the page as I had hoped. So we still have a little bit of work to do here. I need to look at exactly what that wrapping has done. But you get the idea. We can apply some CSS. Actually, I may have applied it at the wrong level. Let's put it in the wrapper layer of this. Try that again. And there we go. So I had the CSS applied to the wrong layer. So we have that. And if we come in and do a horizontal now, so we could say class for the horizontal element, and we'll go over to our CSS and throw that one in, and we can style each of these. You'll see me using this deep selector. And that's because CSS isolation requires this for child elements. So we're working with the children of the main page here. And it is applying these to the children through a CSS selector, basically. So let's go grab another darker color off that blog post again. So we can apply it. And these colors may look familiar, by the way. I use them quite frequently. So if this is your first time seeing some of this content or my show, you may wonder where these colors are coming from. I use them quite a bit. These are my favorites here. So we'll throw a little bit darker blue on that. We'll keep the white foreground. And if we go back to our application, there we go. That looks a lot more like what we have in my examples. Okay. Yeah, so Fuel, it does rename all of the CSS classes to unique identifier on compilation. So you won't see those IDs in the CSS. Now, as far as the question about can you change the ID of a component at runtime, is that going to break the CSS? No, because that unique ID is not an ID attribute, rather it is a custom attribute. So if I look at my component code again, or the rendered HTML of it, there is the identifier there. Now you'll notice it is not, why it's putting it there, let's see, there we go. It is not ID equals, it is just the attribute. So it's at the attribute level. It's not at the value level. So there's no ID attribute in front of the value. So that in itself is the attribute. All right. So it won't interfere with your IDs. It's not an actual ID. And it just gives it a tight scope for CSS to apply itself to. So we'll use vertical and horizontal. You can see the CSS code is much, much smaller. So the trade-off here, again, I've written a lot of CSS if I want to do this without components. I've written a lot of HTML or markup code if I want to do it with components. So the trade-off here is the responsibilities are being shifted around. We're not writing really any more or less code per se. It's just we're choosing a different language to write it in. So we can take this a step further even, and we can try to use both the things together. We can mix the grid and the stack panels. So let's take a look at an example where we want to build a display like this. Okay, let's grab the HTML first and we'll work from there. And I'll try to re-engineer this example so we have a similar output. So first off, we have a grid container with 2 stacks in it. These are the same stack panels that we wrote earlier. So actually, let's not delete this code here. Let's just move it down so we can borrow. So we want to get our stack panels that we wrote earlier and move those up and replace this code because it's going to be the same thing that we were working with earlier. So now we have our stack layouts, but we want a grid to contain these 2 stack layouts and this weather symbol. So we need to define the Telerik layout here. So we'll say Telerik grid layout, and then we need to define exactly what this grid layout is. So let's open this up in CodePen where we get a better view of it. Let's change this to full page view. There we go. This is what we want it to look like. And if we draw some lines here, we can actually see this is a grid. So let's draw some lines. We've got the grid here, and this is going to be a 2-column grid. So we have grid column 1 and grid column 2. And then we have one element that spans 2 columns. So while this is still a 2-by grid, we have an element that is crossing 2 of those cells. So we need to accommodate for that. So we need to define a grid layout columns, and inside of that we'll put a grid layout column. And this one is going to be a width of, and then let's take and look at our blog post for a little bit of a cheat sheet here and figure out what the width is. So these are just this is a 1x2. So the first row is going to be 1 fraction wide. And again, the self-closing tags are preferable for me here. So I'm going to use one of those. And then we want the second column to be twice as large as the first. So that's what that FR means. It's a fractional value. So the first column is going to be 1 unit. The second column will be twice the size of the first one. I believe in XAML, you can say star instead of fraction. So you can just say star for 1 or 2 star for 2. In here we use FR for that value. So we've got the width and the height, or the width. We don't necessarily need a height for this one, so I'm going to go ahead and just plug in the grid layout items. And inside of the grid layout items, we need an item. And that first item is going to be the stack panel. Like so. The second item, so we're going to need another grid layout item. Remember, each of these elements needs to be in their own layout item for them to assign themselves to a cell in the grid. If we put them all inside of the same grid layout item, they will all go in the same cell. So we need to make sure we have one of these for each of these items. And then we'll put this sun emoji right here and close that off. Now, this might not look ideal when we first run it, and that is intentional. So don't worry too much about the way this is going to show up. We will fix it. Let's take a look at what we got. So we've got this item here. It's a little hard to see. Let's throw some styling on this again. My CSS classes are still here. They're not applying because, again, I took off that wrapper div. That CSS isolations feature needs a root level component to work properly. We'll go ahead and drop that in there. That is something I saw on the ASP.NET Core Git issues, by the way, is people don't like that this is required for this to work. So there is an issue out there to remove the necessity of having a root level div for this to work. I don't know if they're going to just automate the fact that it will add it on its own, or do something like what is it called? React. React has an element that looks like this that will do essentially what this root level div is doing. We'll see if they implement something like that. Okay, so now we can see we've got an issue. We've got our two columns here, and this item, first of all, isn't styled very nicely, but it's rendering down here at the bottom. And I've got a question here that's a good one from Timebender. Does Telerik or Blazor have a side menu similar to a hamburger menu? Yes, we do. So if we go to demos.telerik.com and check out the Blazor demos, there is a under layout, you will find the where is this guy? I thought it was under layout. Maybe it's, oh, sorry, navigation, drawer. So we have a drawer menu that is really nice. Works well for, you can have it push completely out and go modal. There's a couple different ways that you can use this. The mini view is really cool because it still leaves you with icons that you can navigate with when the drawer is closed. And you can totally customize what goes in here. You can have hierarchical components. You can template this out and put your own content in it. So this is a very simple look at this component, but you can put basically other components and all sorts of things in there. And you can also have left and right drawers as well. So you can have them on either side of the application, depending on what you see fit. So there's your link, Timebender, to that component. Your built-in hamburger menu component. It works really well. I use it in, you can see it in the Blazing Coffee application there on demos.telerik.com as well. So let's style these a little bit, just so it makes it a little easier to see. We'll drop this weather symbol into our application, and I'm going to try to make sure I do this without putting any of the layout values in there. I didn't copy that correctly because I want to make sure we're using the Telerik layout component as much as possible here, just to show that we don't have to use these so let's take that and that out as well. There are some nested layouts in that example, so we might need to tackle those too. And we'll run that again. And then through the CSS isolation, I'm missing that value. And that should style it, except I didn't put this, I believe. Yeah. So on the grid layout as well, we'll drop a class in there. Nope, that's not the one. Sorry, it's not on the grid. It is on the last item. Let's see. We might be able to get away with putting it here. We may need another layout item in this, though. Let's see if we can pop it on that. There we go. That looks better. That did the trick. Everybody's getting hungry for lunch already. Give me about 10 more minutes. You can run for that hamburger. So we've got something here that's sort of working, but we need to move the elements around a little bit. The way the elements come into this, if we put the grid on screen, we can probably see this a little bit easier. But what's happening here is as the elements are defined, they are dropping into the grid. So the first element we defined is the vertical stack panel. The second element is the horizontal stack panel. The third is the sun emoji, and then we don't have a fourth, but the way we set up our grid, it needs 4 cells to properly render. Remember, it's a 2x2, so it has 2 columns and 2 rows, and this 4th column on the second row, or second column of the second row, is not filled by anything. But if we were to move the sun emoji up and then tell the final item to span both of the columns, we can have that layout. So let's see if we can do that. I'm going to go into our docs real quick to see exactly if I can move that in here. I haven't done this before. It's a fairly new component. I need to make sure that this will move it accordingly without me having to write CSS to do it. So if I go to grid layout, let's look at the documentation real quick. I need to go to the items. And we do have a row span feature. So let's look at the row span first. And we do have a column number. So let's try that as well. So this one we want to be in column 1. So let's try that and see if our item can move from one column to the next. So make sure we rebuild here and get the latest version. I am using .NET 5 for this, so I don't have hot reload or anything like that going. So I didn't get that in the first column. I may need to apply those values to the other columns here as well. So that is in grid column 1. Let's try moving these around. So I want this to be in 1, and I want the horizontal stack panel to be in column, column 2, and then I want this one to be in column 1, and I want it to span 2 rows. No, sorry, 2 columns. Column span 2. Let's try that. Let's see if I got that right. We're getting close. I need to move this one up. I may need to set the row value there as well. So we'll make sure this is row 1, column 1. There we go. So we got pretty close there. We may need to just adjust some padding or something on this one, and we should be good to go. But the point here is we moved this item around. It started off like this, and as we moved those columns, its position in the columns and rows around, we're able to shift it, even though the markup didn't, the markup wasn't defined in a way that this item is first. It's actually last in the markup, but we've moved it to the first position now because we've explicitly set the row and column on those items. And then the last item in here spans 2 columns now because we gave it that property to span those 2 columns. So we're able to find this all through markup. This one final little bit of white space in here. If we look at this, it is probably something we can just write a little bit of CSS to fix. It either needs the content is set to stretch. Let's see. I'm trying to see exactly what would be needed to fix that. Let's see if we can add to our vertical element. Height of 100%. There we go. That did the trick. So just a little bit of a height adjustment here. So if we take the vertical element here and just make sure that it occupies 100% of the height of that space, then we have achieved our layout for this weather component. So how about that? We were able to do that. The weather icon here, I don't think we got to center that one. We got a couple minutes left. We could probably adjust this to center it as well. I believe we could do that in a couple different ways. One way is just using another layout component. So the item in here doesn't have a layout around it, so it is just doing default whatever HTML and CSS is going to do in that scenario. So if we took another Telerik stack layout and placed it around this item here, we could use our orientation attribute and set this to the horizontal orientation, and then tell it to horizontally align this to the center. And save that. And I've got too many windows open here. We'll go ahead and reload that. It should center this time. There we go. Now we've got that one centered as well. So that looks exactly like what we had in the pure CSS demo. The pure CSS demo that I wrote, I'll pull that one up one more time. We'll go back to my blog here and look at the final example. And let's look at the CSS for it. And you can see that there are many lines of CSS here. We can paste this in and compare. If we go over here, we have 16 lines of CSS total. That's just for the colors and a little bit of a height and font adjustment. If we look at the pure CSS approach without the components, we have, I did not paste the right content in, did I? Yeah, I did, there we go. It is another, so let's take this to an even 20, so easy math, 20 through 58, so 38 lines of code. 38 lines of code without the component, 16 lines of code with the component. So it's a little more than double the CSS code required because we use the components instead. Now, on the flip side of that, we did write a lot more HTML. So the trade-off is those extra 20 lines of CSS code translated to probably an extra 20 lines of HTML code or Razor code. So there is a trade-off, but if you're in the mindset of, this is the way I understand that layouts work, I understand the nesting here, this makes sense to me, applying these things from a different file that I can't visually see in the tree here doesn't work with me as well as this does. Maybe you're coming from, again, a XAML background. This looks a lot easier for you to wrap your head around. This might be ideal. And then also you do gain the ability here that you can repeat with templates. Inside of any of these, you can just throw, for eaches in and that type of thing and surround these different layouts with values. You can also data bind to the orientation values as well as the grid, column, and row values. So you can programmatically change these things in addition to the number of fractions on the grid width as well. So you could do that too. So you could set this width at runtime, for example. So we could do a little bit of that really quick. Something like that would look like this. We could come in and add a code block here. And we could say this is an int of grid column width the first grid column width is equal to 1. The second column width is going to be double that. Let's duplicate this. And you could programmatically apply these to this here. So you do need to put the FR on this. So there's going to be a little bit of code there. So you'd have to have a string declared. So we could do it this way and just say string is going to be the first column width plus the text FR. We can just be really lazy about this. It's just a demo. And then the second column, we'll do that as well. Just making sure we append that FR in the end of it. I don't know if we could inline that. We might actually even be able to inline that with some Razor code. But programmatically, this might be a little bit easier. And then we could just data bind to these ints. So we could do a, let's go ahead and make those properties. So they get and set on that. And thank you, IntelliSense, for all of that extra code I didn't ask for. Don't you love when IntelliSense helps? There we go. So we could put some values out here like this, and then we need a couple inputs. At bind value. And I'm just riffing, so hopefully this works. So we've got the first column width, and we will do the second as well. And then what we should be able to do here now is say at column 1 at column 2. Let's see if we can set these things dynamically. So if I were to take this one and say 2, there we go. If I wanted to make the first column 10 wide, we've got the ability to do that. And we could do our 3 by 5 or the by 56 even. So you can see the point here is if we wanted to make these equal 1 by 1, we're data binding now easily to a layout. This is much more difficult to apply to CSS. It is possible. It requires CSS variables and passing those through to the DOM that way. So let's see, what do we got here? So yeah, Maui is going to be pretty interesting as well. Love it. So Maui will let you do this type of thing with the Blazor syntax, like the Razor code syntax, but with native components. So we'll have to see how that works out. I think that looks like a really cool way of doing things too, if you're wanting to stay within the native world and not go over to HTML and CSS. It's nice they're looking at bringing Blazor over to that as well. Then there's the Maui where you can use standard components as well. So very cool. So I know we've got another show coming up today, and hopefully this shows you all of the things that are possible with the Telerik layout components. You can do this in CSS, you can do it in HTML and Razor. It's all amazing stuff. And I think with that, we are done for today. That is our Blazor Power Hour. We've got Sam coming up here, I guess, in just a few minutes. And hopefully he's talking about Maui, so we can chat about that. All right, take care, everybody, and we'll see you next week.